Part of, I think, the concern that I have here, and this has been a concern for critics of the administration for some time, is the conflation of tyranny and terror. And that may be where the mixed signals or the lack of consistency that Senator Chafee and Senator Boxer and others were alluding to arises. We are unanimous in wanting to root out terror. It appears that even within the administration there's ambiguity with respect to our views on tyranny. Tyranny is problematic, but if engaged in by an ally of ours or a country that's sufficiently powerful that we don't think we can do anything about it, doesn't prompt military action. In other cases, it does. Part of the, I think, debate and the divisiveness of Iraq had to do with the fact that it appeared that the administration sold military action in Iraq on the basis of concern about terror, and then the rationale shifted, or at least got muddied, into an acknowledged desire to get rid of a tyrant. And I guess what I'm trying to figure out here, and this is particular to military action and military incursions, do we have a well thought through doctrine that we can present to the world that explains when we feel that military action is justified and when it is not? Apparently it's not justified in Sudan, where there's a genocide taking place. It wasn't justified in Rwanda, despite, I think, unanimity that that was one of the greatest tragedies that occurred in my lifetime. There are a number of circumstances in which we have felt that such incursions or nation building are not appropriate despite the evidence of great tyranny, and yet in Iraq and perhaps in Iran and perhaps in other circumstances we think it is. And so what I'm looking for is some clearly articulated statement as to when you think, as Secretary of State, military action is appropriate. Or do you think, alternatively, that we should just be, the administration should be able to engage in sort of ad hoc judgments as it goes along as to whether, well, you know, let's take these folks out and let's not take these folks out?
Well, it's a very interesting question, Senator. It's one that actually is debated in academy around the world. How can you think about a standard for the use of military force? In
Although, it's not to interrupt, but of course this is not academic because we have 150,000 troops over there right now.
But it's exactly my point, that when you're not debating it in the academy, it's a bit more difficult to have a hard and true definition of when one would use military force and when one would not, because circumstances differ, and one has to, when choosing a policy course, look at the mix of tools available to you. Military force should really be a last resort, certainly not a resort that is early on in the process, because so much at stakes and so much is at stake, and lives are at stake, and war is an unpredictable, blunt instrument. And so it is indeed, outside the confines of the academy, very difficult to have a specific definition of when you use force and when you do not. I think that when one looks at Iraq, you look at a circumstance in which an awful lot of factors came together to make the case of Saddam Hussein approachable really ultimately only through the use of military force. That it was, in that sense, a last resort, because you had had 12 years of failed diplomacy after a war in which he'd fought a war of aggression, in which he had then signed on to certain obligations, not kept those obligations. He signed on to the obligations, by the way, in order to end the 1991 conflict. He then didn't live up to those obligations, flaunted them before the international community, continued to threaten his neighbors, continued to threaten our pilots, trying to enforce the no-fly zones. We did have someone with a history and a present and a shadow of the future concerning the world's most dangerous weapons, and we had someone who was an ally of terror and was in the world's most dangerous region. I think he had the whole package.
Dr. Rice, I don't mean to interrupt you, but I know that I'm going to be running out of time, so I see that yellow light going off. I guess my point is not to relitigate the Iraq issue. I think it's to move forward. The concern that many of my constituents in Illinois express is that we went into Iraq, at least in their minds, because of a very specific threat of terror. Not tyranny, but terror. Had the administration sold the plan to go into Iraq based on this complex mix, then it's not clear it would have generated public support. That's past. What now, as we move forward and we look at Iran or we look at North Korea or these other circumstances, I think it's important for us to be clear that the American people have to have an honest accounting of why we're going in, because once we're in, we're stuck.
Yes.
And we're now going to be spending at least $200 billion in Iraq, and we've lost over 1,300 lives, and it's counting. And so part of the public diplomacy, both internationally as well as domestically, requires this administration to at least be able to articulate these reasons in a way that are coherent and somewhat consistent. I understand that the world is complicated, and it's not always going to be fitting into the neat boxes of the academy. But right now, at least, it seems like it's a moving target both for the American people and for the international community.
Well, Senator, I appreciate that, but if I could just speak to the moving target notion, because I don't think it's been a moving target. And the fact is, tyranny and terror are linked. They are linked. We know that if we deal with Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda and the organization that did 9/11, we're still going to be dealing with its spawn, and we're still going to be dealing with the ideology of hatred that it's been perpetrating. And we know that the ground in which that ideology of hatred has grown and matured and prospered is the ground of places in the world where there's a freedom deficit and where the anger and hopelessness has been channeled into these very malignant forces.
Absolutely, but again, I know I'm out of time here, but that's true in Sudan. There's a lot of anger in Sudan. There's a lot of anger all through sub-Saharan Africa, and yet we don't make these decisions. So I'm not disputing that if you have a vibrant democracy and a healthy, functioning free market system, there's less likelihood of terrorism. And I think all of us recognize that connection. But we're making very specific calculations on the basis of flawed information or flawed intelligence and finite resources. And so we've got to make the best judgments we can in these circumstances. And so the fact that there's a link somewhere between terror and tyranny is not sufficient for us to be making decisions about spending $200 to $300 billion or sacrificing the lives of American servicemen and women.
Senator, I appreciate that, but I have to say I don't think it's a vague link. When you talk about the Middle East, it's a pretty clear link. You're talking about the rise of Islamic extremism. Mm-hmm. You're talking about jihadism. You're talking about the ground in which it grew up. And you're talking about a very narrow definition of terrorism if you only talk about trying to take down the Al-Qaeda organization.
I think that's fair, and if that's the case, and again, I don't want to belabor this, but I'm just trying to give you a sense of where I think our public diplomacy fails. There's certainly a link between tyranny in Saudi Arabia and terrorism, and yet we make a whole series of strategic decisions about accommodating the Saudi regime. And I'm not saying that's a bad decision, but what I am saying is that the degree to which you, as the spokesperson for U.S. foreign policy, is able to articulate greater consistency in our foreign policy, and where those links exist between tyranny and terror, you are able to apply those not just in one or two areas, but more broadly, then I think your public diplomacy is going to be more successful.
Thank you.